He is one of the most powerful men on earth, and yet the ruler of the United Arab Emirates maintains a relatively low profile on the world stage. But with hostility between the U.S. and Iran threatening chaos across the Middle East, Mohammed Bin Zayed could soon emerge as a key player in bringing down tensions in the region. Outside his country, he's often known as MBZ, and a new feature in the New York Times Magazine explores his mission to reshape the future of the Middle East. Robert Worth is a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and the author of that story. He joins me now from Washington. Robert, thanks very much for being with us. In your piece, you describe MBZ as a socially liberal autocrat whose country looks different depending on where you stand. Tell us a little bit about who he is and what you meant by that.
Well, he's an interesting character. First of all, he is the leader of a very wealthy country, small but very wealthy. That's a very strong U.S. ally. In some respects, he's quite progressive. He's stood up for the rights of women and put them into powerful positions in his government. He's a relatively secular character who's fought hard against, political Islam. And who's worked hard also to build a non-oil future for his country. He's also quite tolerant, or his policies have been regarding religions. There are Hindu temples, there's lots of Christian churches in his country, unlike Saudi Arabia, where you don't see that kind of thing. But at the same time, he is anything but a Democrat. He inherited his position. In all likelihood, the power will stay within his family. He's not looking to have democratic elections anytime soon.
And Robert, why should we be watching him?
Well, he's, as I mentioned earlier, his country is very, very wealthy from oil and gas. He's sitting on more than 1.3 trillion in sovereign wealth funds, and he's built up a very powerful military that has an especially good special forces, elite commandos, which he has deployed around the region in his effort to push back against Islamists. So even though it's a small country, it's been amazingly active. You've seen his forces at work in Libya, in the Sinai Peninsula, and a little bit in Syria, in Yemen, and in the Horn of Africa, where the UAE, his country, has a whole network of ports that he has leveraged to play a diplomatic role throughout that area.
Yeah, tell us more about that. The title of your piece is Mohammed Bin Zayed's Dark Vision of the Middle East's Future. Describe for us this campaign that he has led against what he views as this threat of Islamist political movements.
Well, it really started in earnest after the Arab Spring in 2011, when he began to see that what happened after the initial protest movements was the rise and empowerment of Islamist groups of all varieties. You had the milder ones, like in Tunisia, and variations on the Muslim Brotherhood. You also had ISIS in Syria. And he really felt that they all posed a threat, because even the milder ones would create a very intolerant, he believes, sort of Islamic or Islamist government. And he thinks that this populist strain is dangerous, and that's one of the reasons he doesn't think that democracy at this point would be good for the Middle East. And so he really, over the past several years, working in some cases with allies, he's been instructive in helping get the Saudis on the same side, has worked hard to push back and to empower more autocratic figures in most cases who he feels, at least for the moment, are going to be more responsible than some kind of Brotherhood-style Islamist government.
Well, you touched on this. In many ways, MBZ's agenda for the United Arab Emirates could be viewed as liberal by some measures. Describe his mission for us.
Well, I think fundamentally, it's about stability. It's about maintaining order. Governments, even if they're not, democratic or the kinds of governments we would necessarily like to see ideally. I think he fears that the alternative's much, much worse, that you might get, ISIS-style governments in some places. He believes, for instance, that if they were to hold genuinely democratic elections in Saudi Arabia tomorrow, that you'd end up with quite an illiberal regime, and he's afraid of that taking place. He thinks it's important to stand up for the state in all these places. But he's played, in other words, he's backed more autocratic figures, for instance, like Khalifa Haftar, the general who's fighting in Libya right now, who has been a frustration, frankly, to some in the West and the United States, who feel that Haftar is just too power hungry and not willing to make concessions and deals. However, MBZ has also done some valuable diplomatic work that wasn't in that same mold. For instance, his government was instructive in bringing about the peace between Ethiopia and Eritrea.
And so is the bottom line here, so you said stability is really what he appears to be focused most clearly on, and is this idea that in his view, democracy just isn't compatible with the Middle East?
I'm not sure he would answer that question in a kind of long-term, ultimate way, but I think certainly he would say that for the moment, it's just that the forces of political Islam are too powerful, that they're being urged on, not just because they're popular in of themselves, but the government of Turkey, for instance, has really cheered on and even provided weapons to Islamists in some places. The government of Qatar has often played a role like that. And then individual people have given money to Islamist groups all around the region. So there's a feeling that not only does this movement have the wind behind it in a popular sense, but it's being egged on by various figures. And I think he feels that that's just, for the moment, too dangerous to leave that up to a popular vote.
Well, as we've been reporting, tensions in the Middle East have been inflamed by the recent hostilities between the United States and Iran. The Trump administration continues to pursue a maximum pressure campaign of economic sanctions against the regime. Tell us how MBZ is pursuing a different strategy with regard to Iran and why.
I think MBZ's policy, like that of some of the other Gulf nations, has shifted in an interesting way. In the past, he's been very hawkish on Iran. He, as I mentioned, his fundamental views that political Islam is dangerous. And let's remember that Iran is the Islamist country par excellence. It's a theocracy. Mm-hmm. So for a long time, MBZ, like the leaders of Saudi Arabia, tried hard to persuade the United States to take a tougher line on Iran. And in fact, MBZ was a little unhappy with the nuclear deal that President Obama's administration negotiated. There was a fear, I think, with MBZ and some of his peers in the Gulf that the United States under Obama was appeasing Iran. And so initially, MBZ was pleased to have Trump in office because he felt that Trump was going to be more unquestioningly on his side in this matter, that he's going to be more aggressive with Iran. However, the shift is interesting, and I think what it is that MBZ has realized that Trump is somewhat unpredictable in this respect, that he may talk tough, but it's not clear whether or when he will take strong action. And I think it's also just become clearer, and frankly, this is a longer-term thing, but I think the leaders of the Gulf have realized that if there's going to be a war between the United States and Iran, their own countries, let's just say, the UAE, cities like Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and Riyadh and Saudi Arabia are on the front line. They're right across the water from Iran. And if there's going to be a war, they might be among the very first targets. And I think that recognition has made them realize that a more diplomatic course makes more sense. And so they've been trying hard to reduce the temperature in this confrontation.
All right, Robert Worth, it's a fascinating deep dive. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
It's a pleasure.